Hello, Ken Hayes here. This is a brief, somewhat conceptual video on the relationship between two ubiquitous production techniques, those being equalization and dynamic range compression, and their relationship to their analogs in music. Equalization affects the frequency domain, that is, it alters the spectral content of the signal to which it is applied, while compression acts on amplitude, but importantly occurs in the time domain. What aspects of music occur in the frequency and time domains? That's right, pitch, and to a less direct but equally important extent, timbre, occupies the frequency domain, and rhythm and tempo are in the time domain. What I am going to discuss is how equalization and compression relate directly to musical parameters of a piece, and are not simply tools to get the crispiest, fattest, punchiest, loudest sound out of a production, irrespective of its actual intrinsic musical properties. Let's start with frequency. A musical note's pitch corresponds to the frequency of its fundamental tone, and the key of a song also correlates to the pitch, and therefore frequency, of the resolving note. Many tutorials will discuss, for example, the frequency values of the body, presence, and air of a recording, be it an instrument, voice, or sound effect. Let's say that the body of a voice is centered around 200 Hz, the presence around 2000 Hz, and the air around 7000 Hz. These are certainly fine rules of thumb. The numbers depend on the particular recording and the microphone, but they also depend on the key. Here is a vocal of a song I've released. Let's listen for a moment.
Known before I courted that love had been so hard to win.
Obviously, when I say recorded, I don't mean I sang them myself. These vocals are in the key of A flat, which has a pitch of 415.30 Hz, and its multiples, and its factors divided by 2 each time. I've already separated a small section here. It hits the key center of the relative minor, F, which is 349.23 Hz. Let's say that we listen to this vocal. I've already processed it, but let's say that we want to remove mud, so we cut heavily around 300 Hz or so. Let's say 350 for demonstration purposes. And let's listen to what happens after we cut 350 Hz out of this part. Well, we can listen to the whole thing. But this section is that note, but let's listen to part of it beforehand and see what happens when we get there.
So hard to win.
Now, obviously, we didn't just cut the mud. We actually cut the fundamental note, the fundamental pitch of the note out. Let's A-B this real quickly. Here's the original. Here's with the cut. It obviously sounds very thin after the cut. So let's say that we want to add some brightness as well and continue in this comedy of errors. So we choose around 4000 Hz to add both some presence and brightness. It may be hard to hear, but I chose a frequency of 3951 Hz. To exaggerate and really drive the point home, let's play a sine wave of 3951 Hz, excuse me, along with that note.
So hard to win.
Now, it may be a little easier to hear in the original equalization. I'll take the sine wave back out again. Let's A-B, adding and removing this pole. There isn't a lot of frequency content around that range, that specific frequency, because that is in fact the pitch of a very high B, which is the tritone of the note F. Now, it's obvious why we wouldn't want the tritone of a note to be added heavily and mixed with the note. We can listen to the sine wave again to hear why not. that is an extremely dissonant frequency and is in fact noisy. Let's listen to the rest or some portion of the vocal with that equalization applied.
Known before I courted that love had been so hard to.
Aside from simply being too much, which I did for demonstration purposes again, that does create this kind of noisy dissonant effect to the vocals. But let's look at an example of something that somebody might actually do rather than choosing exactly the tritone frequency and boosting it heavily. Let's listen to this kick drum. Oh, that's for a later part of the discussion. Let me turn that compressor off. Somewhat typical 808 type drum. Now, let's say that we wanted to cut some of the sub and boost the punch. So we cut at 50 Hertz and we boost at 85 Hertz, which is what this EQ is already doing. Now let's listen. Let's turn it off. Again, I'm dramatizing how much equalization is applied, but you can tell that that completely destroys the sound of the kick drum. This is because the fundamental of this kick drum is centered around 50 Hertz. So if you just think of your rules of thumb and think 50 is, the sub part of the kick and 85 is the punch of the kick, and you apply it to this kick drum, then you'll completely destroy it. Even if we reduce the scale so that we're affecting the kick drum less, we're still destroying the sound of the kick drum. As we increase it, completely destroying. I see that I had the gain at minus 12 here, so that may have exaggerated the effect even more, but even with the gain back to 0, we're completely removing the body of the drum to add that little punch. So we need to keep these things in mind. Maybe to get rid of the sub, you should cut at 30 Hertz or put a high-pass filter. It can be very close to the fundamental, say at 40 Hertz. But we don't want to remove the actual fundamental pitch of the drum. Now let's briefly turn our attention to compression and its relationship to tempo in the time domain. So as you probably know, compression reduces the dynamic range of a signal. That is, it makes the louder parts quieter. More complete tutorials on compression are out there, and I may make one in the future, but for now we'll focus on two parameters of the compressor: attack time and release time. Attack time is the duration over which the signal must exceed the compressor's threshold before compression begins, and release time is the duration over which the signal must return to below the compressor's threshold for compression to cease. If we zoom in on the waveform of this kick drum, we can see that the transient occurs near right the beginning of each clip. So if we have a short attack time, then compression will begin almost immediately. It will in fact begin if the attack time is 2 milliseconds, it will begin after 2 milliseconds. So let's see what happens. We'll leave the release at 50 milliseconds as we play these quarter notes at 120 beats per minute, and we lower and raise the attack time. We can see we get that click at the beginning of each kick drum when we have this very short attack time, because we get that very short transient and then compression brings the level down a fair amount. Where with a longer attack time we get more of a boomy sound that the 808 is more known for. Now if we leave this attack very high, increase the release time, we're just going to make it quieter. Or we leave the attack short and increase the release time, excuse me. We're just going to make the drum quieter. Let's start with a low release time. So we still have that click, but we've reduced the overall volume of the signal as well. But as far as relating this to the tempo, because so far we've just looked at the actual properties of the clip itself, which you'd probably already consider when applying compression. Let's loop this section where we have these 30-second notes here. Turn the compressor off to get an idea of what the dry signal sounds like. And then you might actually have a section like that before a nasty drop in an electro house track. Let's turn the compressor back on. And let's have a very short attack time and a very short release time. And listen to that. We'll A/B that too. So again, we just have this kind of click sound, and then the body of the kick is mostly gone. But importantly, what is the length of a 30-second note at a tempo of 120? Well, you can use your hand calculator or a calculator like this and see that it's 62.5 seconds. Milliseconds. And that's a rate of 16 hertz, which is good because it's still below the audible range for most people, except at excessive volumes. So let's see what happens as we leave this very short attack time, but increase the release time past 62.5 seconds. See, increasing it much past doesn't really change the signal anymore, but it really sort of flattens and smears out the transient so that we don't even have that nice click anymore because the compressor stays on. You can see that the click returns when we reduce the release time well below 65 milliseconds, or 62.5 milliseconds. Now, even so, having such a short attack time is really compromising a lot just to get that little click in there. And we can see that as the release time increases, longer than the transient hits, we have an extremely flat sound that really is just not useful as a kick drum. So while compression can help you get so-called punch, it can also remove the dynamics, although flattening out the dynamics after the transient hit is what gives you the punch or the click that kind of makes the kick more defined. But having a release time that's too long, especially longer than the length of the note value that you have in a roll like this, will absolutely remove all of the dynamics and make compression completely counterproductive. But a little bit of click, a little bit of punch is good. And as long as we keep in mind what the parameters we're trying to stay inside of based on the tempo of the song or the transients of the sample itself, we can not completely destroy those dynamics. So again, these examples are exaggerated to demonstrate the relationship between either frequency and pitch, the frequency of an equalizer and the pitch of a song, or the relationship between tempo and note value and compressor attack and release values. But these are things that you would really do in the production of a song. So it is good to have them in mind as you produce, even if you're not forcing yourself to stay entirely within this box or using it to actually select your EQ settings or compressor settings. Because the only rule at the end of the day is that music should sound good. But I haven't seen any tutorials that discuss this exact relationship between the two effects discussed and the actual compositional analogs and keys or pitches or tempos or note values. So I hope you found this video useful, and if so, please like and subscribe for more production and music tutorials in the future, as well as more music. Thank you for watching.